45,000 people. That is how many arrive in this town at the peak of the holidays, into a place whose permanent population is 5,145. 9 visitors for every resident. Now, 2 corrections straight away. The Gold Coast is Australia's biggest holiday resort, and this is not the Gold Coast. And the town was not destroyed. Last summer, Lakes Entrance recorded the biggest rise in accommodation spending of anywhere in Australia. So what was destroyed? 3 things. A freshwater lake system the size of a small sea. A way of taking a holiday that 4 generations of Victorian families grew up on, and a fishing fleet. All 3 were killed by the same thing, and that thing is the reason the town exists at all. In 1889, men cut a hole through a sand dune, and it has never been allowed to close since. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. A note before we begin. This story is told on Gunai country, and on the coast that belongs to the Tatungalung. It contains the names of people who have died. Chapter 1. The Gap That Moved. Start with the sand, because everything here is sand. Running southwest from the town for 151 kilometres is the 90-mile beach. It is one of the longest uninterrupted beaches on Earth, and it is not really a beach at all. It is a barrier, a wall of dune thrown up by Bass Strait over thousands of years, sealing off the water behind it. And what is behind it is enormous. The Gippsland Lakes are the largest inland waterway system in Australia. Lake Wellington, Lake Victoria, Lake King, and the arms and channels that feed them, fed in turn by the Latrobe, the Avon, the Mitchell, the Nicholson, and the Tambo. For all of recorded time before 1889, that water was fresh. The sea got in only when it forced its way. A wet winter would raise the lakes until the pressure broke a gap through the dune, and the water would run out into the strait for a season or a year or a few years. Then the longshore drift would push the sand back across, and the gap would seal, and the lakes would go back to being fresh. The gap moved. It wandered along the coast, opening and closing, never in the same place twice, and for a long stretch it sat about 5 kilometres east of where the town stands now, at the end of what was then called Reeves River. Today, that water is Cunningham Arm, with an E, and the town itself was called Cunningham until the 1st of January 1915. So if you are ever tempted to drop that E, the locals will find you. Now consider what an unreliable hole in a dune means to a shipmaster. It means you cross a bar you cannot see, in a channel that has moved since the last chart, into a lagoon system with no lights. Ships came anyway because Gippsland had timber and cattle and produce and no other way out, and the ships kept not making it. The schooners Jane, Apollo, and John and Elizabeth. The paddle steamer Tommy Norton, wrecked in 1877. The schooner Latrobe, lost in 1878. And it was not only the cargo. Anybody in East Gippsland who needed a doctor, a court, a bank, or a boat out of the district was dependent on whether a channel through a sand dune happened to be open that season. A district of thousands of people had its connection to the rest of the world decided by longshore drift. The first steamer to get in did it in February 1864. The Lady of the Lake, under Captain Cleland, feeling her way through the natural entrance. She worked those lakes for roughly 30 years, and then she sank at the entrance in 1891. That was the arrangement, an inland sea the size of a county, with a door that opened and shut according to the weather, and drowned people on the way through. In 1869, the people of Gippsland petitioned the government in Melbourne to cut them a permanent one. Chapter 2. The Petition. The first attempt came in 1870, and it failed. They dug and the sand came back. Work was abandoned altogether in 1876, with nothing to show for it but a scar in the dune and a bill. Anybody looking at it in 1877 would have concluded the thing could not be done. What changed it was politics, and the man who supplied the politics was Sir Charles Gavan Duffy. Duffy is one of the more improbable figures in Australian public life, an Irish nationalist who had been tried for sedition in Dublin, emigrated, and ended up Premier of Victoria and then Speaker of its Legislative Assembly. He sat for Gippsland, and what he did for the district was not to dig anything. It was to convince the colony to send for the best harbour engineer in the British Empire. His name was Sir John Coode. Coode had built and rebuilt harbours across the world, Portland, Table Bay, Colombo, and works up and down the Australian coast. When a colonial government could not solve a coastal problem, it wrote to Coode. He inspected the Gippsland Lakes site in March of 1878 and delivered his report in December of 1879. What he recommended was 2 long training piers driven out through the dunes, with the channel excavated between them, so that the outgoing water would be concentrated into a single, narrow race, instead of spreading and dropping its sand. And then he wrote the sentence that decides the next 140 years of this town's existence. He did not believe it would keep itself clear. Coode's own report specified that the entrance would have to be dredged, not once. Not to finish the job, permanently. He had looked at the volume of sand coming along that coast and concluded the tide would never move enough of it. Anybody who cut this channel was signing up to maintain it for as long as they wanted it to exist. Read that plainly. The entrance was designed, from the first drawing, as a machine that would need feeding forever. Everybody involved knew it. They did it anyway, and on the evidence they were right too, because the alternative was the gap that moved. It is worth being fair to the men who took that on. They were not reckless. They had watched 2 attempts fail. They had a report from the most respected coastal engineer of the age telling them exactly what it would cost to maintain. And they made a decision that a permanent door was worth a permanent bill. Given what the old entrance was doing to shipping, that was a defensible call. And most of what this town has, it has because they made it. There is a third name on the works. William Wardell, the Inspector General of Public Works. The same Wardell who designed St. Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne, whose office had been recommending a permanent entrance since 1869. Work resumed in the early 1880s. The contract went to J. Carpenter and Son for £6,891, and the settlement the workmen built for themselves beside the cut was known as Carpenter Town. In February 1888, a dredge called the Wombat began cutting the last of the channel, and between the unfinished cut and Base Strait stood 12,000 sandbags. Chapter 3. The Storm. Picture what was there on the night of the 14th of June, 1889. A trench through a sand dune, most of the way finished. A chain drawn across it. 12,000 bags of sand stacked into a wall, holding back the ocean until the engineers were ready to let it in on their own terms. The Wombat working in the channel. And on the other side of that wall, in the middle of a Gippsland winter, Bass Strait. The storm came in that night and took the decision out of their hands. The sea went through the barrier. One account describes it going in the form of a gigantic tidal wave. It flooded the village. It tore the dredge Wombat and the steamer Mystery from their moorings and swept them away. The machine that had spent 16 months digging the channel was picked up and carried off by the channel on the night the channel opened, before anybody had declared it finished. Think about what that night was for the men who had built it. 16 months of work, a wall of sandbags they had stacked by hand, and a schedule that said the sea would be admitted when they were ready and not before. They went to bed with the barrier standing. They woke up to find the ocean had let itself in, taken their dredge off its moorings, and put water through the streets of the village. Nobody had planned to open it in June. Nobody had planned to open it at night. The engineering had simply been overtaken by the thing it was built to control 4 days early, and there was nothing to do but go and look at it in the morning and decide it had worked. 4 days later, on the 18th of June, they took the chain off the bar and made it official. The steamer Amu, under Captain Gallienne, towed craft out through the new entrance, while crowds stood on the dunes and cheered and rockets went up over the water. They had done it. After 20 years, 2 failed attempts and a bill nobody wants to add up, the Gippsland Lakes had a permanent guaranteed all-weather door to the sea. And that is exactly what it was, a permanent door to the sea. It was also, and this is the entire story, a permanent door for the sea. What came through that door over the next 60 years built every single thing this town has. Chapter 4. What the gut let in. The first thing it built was a port. Deep water, reliable, open in any month, and behind it hundreds of square kilometres of protected lake, with rivers running into it from half of eastern Victoria. Timber came down to it, cattle, produce, and within a few years, fish, because the same channel that let the boats out let the whiting and the flathead and the gummy shark in. The second thing it built was a fleet of steamers, and this is the part that has been almost completely forgotten. The Gippsland Lakes Navigation Company ran the Tangiel and the Bairnsdale. There was the Omeo and the Avon, and there was the SS Gippsland, built at Paynesville in 1908, 14 knots, the largest and fastest vessel ever to work those lakes, running excursions from Bairnsdale down to Lake's entrance and across to Paynesville until she was sold away in 1937. Now here is the thing that makes this town different from every other seaside resort of its era, and it is worth stopping on. Blackpool was built by a railway. Brighton was built by a railway. Every great holiday town of the 19th century was built by a line of rail that put working families on a beach in under 2 hours. The railway never came to Lake's entrance. It reached sail in 1877 and Bairnsdale on the 8th of May 1888, the year before the entrance opened, and there it stopped. It has never gone any further. There is no station in Lake's entrance, and there never has been. So the holiday began on the water. You took the train down from Melbourne to Bairnsdale. Then you walked from the platform to a wharf and got on a steamer. You came down the Mitchell River into Lake King with the whole of the Gippsland Lakes opening up in front of you, and you arrived at your guest house by boat. That is a completely different beginning to a holiday than getting off a train. You arrived on open water and it framed everything that followed. There is a second consequence of that, and it shaped the whole town. Because nobody could drive here easily and nobody could take a train here at all, the people who came did not come for an afternoon. The journey was too long to justify it. If you were going to spend most of a day getting to Lake's entrance, you were going to stay, and the accommodation that got built here was built on that assumption, and the guest houses filled. By 1900, the town was thick with them, and the product they sold was not a weekend. It was a week, or a fortnight, or, for a great many Melbourne and Gippsland families, the whole of January. The infrastructure went up around that. Hotels, the Fern Bank, from 1882. The club, from 1884. A school in 1885. 3 churches by 1901. The first camping park in 1928. The Surf Life Saving Club in 1931. And in 1937, they built the footbridge. If you have never been, this is the detail that explains the place. The ocean beach at Lake's entrance is not at the end of the street. It is on the other side of the water. The town sits on the inland side of Cunningham Arm, and to get to the surf, you cross a long, narrow timber and steel footbridge over the arm and walk through the dunes to the 90-mile beach. Every family holiday in this town for the last 90 years has involved that walk. Towels, thongs, a bucket, somebody's father carrying the esky, all of it strung out across a footbridge over the water. By the peak, In the holidays, 45,000 people were doing it, into a town of 5,000. So stand on the esplanade on a Saturday evening in January 1955 and look at what the channel made. Chapter 5. The Esplanade. It is about 8 in the evening and it is still hot. The light has gone long and orange down the esplanade and the water in the arm has gone flat and metallic, and there are boats moored 3 deep along the front. You can smell 3 things, and they never quite separate. Fish from the sheds, hot fat from the shops behind you, and salt. The footbridge is loud. There is a steady traffic of people going both ways across it. The timber gives slightly under a crowd, and you can hear it. A low knocking, hundreds of feet. Kids run the last stretch of it because there is sand on the other side. Behind the dunes, the caravan parks have their evening going, canvas annexes, guy ropes, a primus hissing somewhere, a wireless, somebody's mother calling somebody in. Every second car in the street has a Victorian plate and a roof rack and a fortnight's worth of gear strapped to it. In the guest houses along the front, they are waiting on the gong. That is not a figure of speech. Dinner is at a set time, and it is announced with an actual gong. And nobody walks into that dining room before it sounds. And the woman who runs the place has been doing this since before the war, and has a view about punctuality. There are more people on this one street tonight than live in the town. In the fortnight either side of New Year, there will be 45,000 of them, into a place of 5,000. And every one of them came past the gap in the dunes to get here. Somebody is fishing off the jetty with a handline and no particular urgency. A pelican has taken up position beside him and is being ignored. Down the strip, the shops are open late because it is January. There is a shilling's worth of noise coming out of the arcade. There is a queue for fish and chips wrapped in newspaper, and the fish came off a boat that is tied up 300 metres away. Along the road, the cypress trees are tall now. They were planted 30 years ago, and they run the length of the esplanade in a line, and most of the people walking under them tonight do not know why they are there. And then, near dark, the boats start coming back in. They come through the gap in the dunes one after another, and here is the thing about this town that you will not find in any other holiday town in Australia. Everybody on that esplanade stops and turns and watches them come through. Holidaymakers watch because it is a spectacle, the swell standing up in the entrance, the boats picking their moment. Everyone else watches for a different reason, and they will not say so out loud in front of the visitors. They watch because in a town of 5,000 people, everybody on that esplanade knows somebody on those boats. The last one comes through. The light goes. Somewhere behind you, the gong goes for second sitting. Nobody standing there tonight is thinking about the channel. It is just the view. Chapter 6. The lakes turn salt. It was already doing 3 things to this place, and it would take the better part of a century for anybody to add them up. The first one is the largest, and most Australians have never heard it. The Gippsland Lakes used to be fresh water, not brackish, not estuarine on the margins. A predominantly freshwater system sealed behind a dune flushed by 5 rivers, opening to the sea only in bursts and then closing again. The reeds, the submerged plants, the fish, the birds and the people who had lived off all of it for thousands of years were the product of fresh water. That is not a small ecological footnote. It is the difference between one kind of world and another. Fresh water and salt water grow different plants, feed different fish, support different birds, and sustain different people. And on the 14th of June, 1889, that stopped being true, permanently. What came through the new door was salt, and it did not come through once. It has been coming through every tide, twice a day, for 137 years. The change was slow enough that nobody alive watched it happen. And total. The great fringing reed beds died back, and where the reeds went, the banks started to erode, because reeds were what held them. The salt-intolerant plants that carpeted the shallows disappeared, and Lake Wellington shifted from a system dominated by rooted plants to one dominated by algae suspended in the water column. Seagrass, which is a marine plant, spread in near the entrance. Then the animals changed. Sharks, stingrays, squid, the European shore crab. Marine species moving in and settling down in water that had been fresh since the last ice age. And around 1990, mangroves appeared in the Gippsland lakes for the first time. Consider what that actually means. Mangroves are a saltwater tree. They did not migrate south because they felt like it. They arrived because the water underneath them had changed into water they could live in. Since 1986, there have been recurring blooms of toxic blue-green algae, closing the fishery, in the town that lives off the fishery. Then, in 2008, they did it again. The entrance was dredged from a maintained depth of around 2.5 metres to 6. Consultants had warned in the years beforehand that going to 6 metres would drive salinity higher, and that the Port Authority would struggle to hold a channel deeper than 4. They went to 6. The Environment Protection Authority afterwards attributed the increase in salinity to the deepening. The salt wedge has since pushed up the lake chain as far as the Port of Sale, at the far western end of the lake system. And in the bluffs east of the town, there are middens, the accumulated shell and bone of Tatunga people living off these lakes for something on the order of 7,000 years, when the water was fresh. That food economy was not taken by a policy or a law or a government. It was taken by a channel. The second thing the channel made was a bar, and the bar has been killing people since before this town had its name. Chapter 7. 200 metres. Here is the mechanism, because you cannot understand the fear without it. Sand moves along the 90-mile beach in enormous quantities, pushed northeast by the prevailing swell. The 2 rock training walls stick out into that current and catch it. The sand piles up against them and spills around the ends, and settles just offshore, directly across the mouth, as a bar. Now add the water coming the other way. When the lake's empty on a run-out tide, an enormous volume of water funnels out through a gap 200 metres wide and meets a Bass Strait swell coming in. The swell hits the shallow bar and the outflowing water underneath it, and the waves stand straight up and break. The safe line through it is marked by leads. Navigation marks you line up from the water. They have to be physically moved because the sand they mark moves, and the whole thing can change inside a minute. And there is one more thing about a bar that a person standing on the shore does not see. Going out is the easier direction, because you are looking at the face of the waves and you can read where they are breaking and pick a gap. Coming home, you are looking at the backs of them. The dangerous water is behind you and it is catching up, and by the time you know a wave has your stern, there is nothing left to do about it. That is why the boats that are lost at lake's entrance are almost always lost on the way in. 200 metres from the wharf, at the end of the day in sight of the town. In January 1949, 2 brothers, Reuben Churchill, 32, and Neil Churchill, 19, went out over that bar in heavy seas. Their boat was found afterwards, drifting awash, with nobody aboard. The Argus called it one of the worst tragedies at lake's entrance in many years. And then there is the 18th of March, 1978. The Shark was a trawler of 37 tonnes, about 20 metres long, coming back in. According to the Age's report 2 days later, a breaker of around 3 metres drove her bow down into the sandbar, and about a minute later a second wave rolled her over. There were 3 men aboard. The skipper, Gavin Farley, 30, of Laura Street, Lake's Entrance. Bob Alexander, 22, of Marlow, and Ron Blowski, 22, of Box Street, Lake's Entrance. They were on the radio as it happened, and the paper printed what was said. Farley: "I've just taken one over the side. I'll hand over Bob." And then Alexander: "This is it, we've had it. A man named Peter Friend watched it from the shore. He was 46 years old, and he described the conditions in the entrance that day as being like Russian roulette. None of the three men were recovered. Now hold the two halves of that together, because they are the whole story in one piece of arithmetic. They cut this channel because the old entrance kept killing men. The shark went down 200 metres from the new one. And the third thing is the reason the first two can never be undone. Chapter 8. The Sand. The channel does not fail. That is the part people get wrong when they hear this story. There was no collapse, no engineering scandal, no moment when it stopped working. It has worked continuously and exactly as designed since June 1889. That is the problem. Its method is very simple, and it has three parts. It lets the sea in permanently, and then the sea does the work. 137 years of tides carrying salt up a lake system that used to be fresh, further every decade, all the way to sail. It catches the sand permanently, because that is what training walls do, and piles it into a bar across its own mouth, and that bar has to be shifted, or the door shuts. And the third part is the one that matters most. Every year that somebody moves that sand, the town becomes less able to survive. Nobody moving it. That is the part that makes it different from an ordinary industrial disaster. A factory that closes stops costing money. A mine that floods gets abandoned. This does not have an off switch because the moment you stop maintaining it, it starts doing something worse than it was doing while you maintained it. Coode knew. He wrote it into the 1879 report. And so every year since, somebody has been out there dredging. The Wombat, from 1879 until 1928, the same dredge the storm swept away, refloated and put back to work. Then the Priestmont, the W.H. Edgar, the Painesville, the Santa Piper from 1963 to 2005. Then the April Hamer, built at Newcastle in 1976 and named for the wife of the Victorian Premier, who worked that bar for about 30 years. Then the Kalimna, the Pelican, and now a trailing suction hopper dredge called the Tommy Norton, which carries the name of a paddle steamer that was wrecked at the old natural entrance in 1877, which tells you something about how long the memory runs in this town. The Tommy Norton relocates somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 cubic metres of sand every year, out of the entrance. And every year, the sand comes back. So the arithmetic of this town is two numbers running against each other forever. 45,000 people arriving through a gap 200 metres wide and 300,000 cubic metres of sand trying to close it. So run the counterfactual. Stop the dredging and the bar builds. The channel shoals. The lakes stop draining properly. The levels rise and they keep rising because 5 rivers are still running into them. Lakes Entrance is a low-lying town on a sand spit. Raymond Island, out in Lake King, is lower. 137 years ago, this town cut a hole to let the sea in, and it has been paying to keep that hole open ever since. And it can never stop paying, and the bill goes up as the sea does. Which raises the only question that matters, and it deserves a straight answer. Chapter 9. What the cut paid for. Was it worth it? Start with the honest case for the channel, because it is a strong one, and it is usually left out. Before 1889, there was a sandbar, a scatter of cottages, and a gap in a dune that moved. There was no town. What the cut built was a functioning deep-water port on a coastline that had almost none, and everything downstream of that port. Today, the Lakes Entrance Fishermen's Cooperative is one of the largest fishing co-ops in the country. It is serviced by around 57 vessels. It handles more than 85 species. More than $30 million worth of fish goes through it in a year, and roughly a third of the entire national school whiting catch is landed there. In one day this January, they put 54 tonnes of seafood across the floor, the biggest haul in a decade. That exists because of the channel, all of it. though the fleet is not what it was, and everybody on that wharf knows it. Licence buybacks, quota, marine park closures, and the long contraction of Australian commercial fishing have taken boats out of that harbour steadily for 40 years. In 2020, the state bought out the last 10 commercial fishing licences on the lakes themselves, ending more than a century and a half of it. The co-op survives, and it has diversified, and it sells to the public off the wharf now. But the town that once counted its wealth in boats counts most of it in beds. And so does the holiday. 4 generations of Victorian families learned to swim on the other side of that footbridge, and the reason there was anything to come to was that the entrance made a town out of a sandbar. Now the other half, and it is the half that keeps the story honest. The Channel did not kill the guest house holiday. The car did. The steamers went in the 1930s. Tourism collapsed through the 1940s under petrol rationing, and when it came back from 1950, it came back on wheels. The guest houses waned, and motels and caravan parks went up in their place, because people were no longer arriving by boat with a fortnight's luggage. They were arriving by car, and a car can leave. The month became a week. The week became a weekend. And then, yes, the aeroplane. The 2 airline policy, the duopoly that had fixed Australian domestic aviation since the 1950s, ended at midnight on the 30th of October 1990. Domestic passenger trips went from 14.6 million in 1990 to 57.1 million by 2015. The best discount fare, in real terms, halved. A week in Bali or a week on the Queensland coast came within reach of families who would once have driven to Gippsland by default. That is real, and it is a genuine cause, and nobody can point to the day it happened. And then there were things that were nobody's fault at all. In the summer of 2019 and 2020, the fires came down through East Gippsland, and an emergency warning was issued covering an estimated 30,000 residents and holidaymakers in and around this town. The Princes Highway was closed for 4 weeks in the middle of peak season. Businesses reported a drop in tourist traffic of around 90% in what should have been the busiest fortnight of their year. Then the pandemic arrived on top of it. So no, the Channel did not do all of this. It only did the part that cannot be reversed. The car took the guest houses and the jet took the long stay, and towns everywhere lost both and got over it. The lakes are not getting their fresh water back, and the bar is not going away, and the dredging is not going to stop. So go and look at what is actually there now. Chapter 10. The Cypresses. The esplanade is still there, and so are the caravan parks, and so is the footbridge, rebuilt, but standing in the same place and doing the same job. On a January evening, the traffic across it looks much as it did 70 years ago. There are 2 objects worth standing in front of. The first is the entrance itself. 200 metres of moving water between 2 rock walls, and if you go tomorrow, there will be a dredge working it, because there is always a dredge working it. Sir John Coode drew it in 1879 and told them it would need feeding forever, and he never saw it open. He designed the most consequential piece of engineering in the district's history and specified in writing that it would never look after itself. He was alive in England when it opened, and he never came back to see it. It opened itself in a winter storm, in the dark, before anybody said it was finished, and the first thing it did was pick up the machine that had been digging it and carry it off into the dark. They found the wombat, and they refloated her, and she went back to dredging that entrance for another 39 years. The second object is on the esplanade, and most people walk past it. In 1924, the town planted 26 Monterey cypresses along the front, one for each local man killed in the First World War. Those are the trees you were standing under in 1955. By the 1990s, they were old and dying and dangerous, and the decision was made to cut them down. All of them. a memorial to 26 dead men taken out with a chainsaw for public safety. The local historical society fought it, and what happened instead is the best thing in this story. In 1998, a chainsaw sculptor named John Brady was brought in and he carved the stumps where they stood. A soldier, a nurse, a wounded man with a donkey, Simpson and his donkey helping a wounded soldier, a family waiting for Dad to come home, and a sea captain for the people lost at the entrance. They stood the memorial back up out of its own dead timber. Down at Jemmy Point, there is one more, a rock with a plaque dedicated by the Rotary Club of Lakes Entrance on the 20th of March 1994, in memory of all those who have lost their lives in the entrance and at sea. It carries no names at all. Not Farley, not Alexander, not Blowski, not the Churchill brothers, not one of the crews from the 1870s. Just everybody, since the beginning, in one sentence. 45,000 people still come here every holidays. The lakes are salt. The guest houses are caravan parks. The fleet is a fraction of what it was. And here is the thing nobody predicted. Over the fortnight from the 20th of December 2025 to the 4th of January 2026, Lakes Entrance recorded the largest increase in accommodation spending of any destination in Australia, 633% in 14 days, 6 years after the fires came to the edge of it. The holiday the Channel built is gone. The town it built is having the best summer in living memory. Every seaside town on earth was made by something that came from somewhere else. A railway, a road, a cheap flight, somebody else's invention arriving from over the hill. This one made itself, with shovels and 12,000 sandbags and a storm on a June night, and it has been holding the door open with both hands ever since. And it can never let go.